Greetings, Bob Fowler here. This class we are calling the puzzle of Paul. The puzzle of Paul. Do you find the Apostle Paul's contradictions puzzling? Contradictions in Paul. How can Paul say in one place that women must keep silent and have no authority within the church, but in another place, Paul praises the leadership of a woman deacon and a woman apostle? Yes, deacon and apostle, Romans 16. What about the places where Paul seems perfectly comfortable with the practice of slavery? There are several such passages in the letters attributed to Paul, but in his letter to Philemon, he all but twists Philemon's arm to persuade the Christian slave owner to free his runaway Christian slave, Onesimus. Now, there's a tangle for you. Or have you found it strange that there is no mention in the book of Acts, the Acts of the Apostles, no mention in there of the 13 letters attributed to Paul in the New Testament? How could someone write the story of Paul's life without referring to any of his letters or citing at least some of their content? This is a vexing puzzle, but there is a way to make sense of what seem to be contradictions. Join me and my facilitators, including my wife, Debbie. Wednesday nights this Easter season, we'll try to put the puzzle pieces together. As many of you as were baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. A marvelous, extraordinary, visionary set of assertions by the beloved Apostle Paul. No longer Jew or Greek, no longer slave or free, no longer male and female, for we are all one. Those distinctions, those old rivalries, those old polarized pairs no longer are valid, no longer count. In this way, in a way, this class that we're starting now will be a sequel to that earlier class. This class will examine the fading of this original vision of radical egalitarianism, anti-patriarchy, anti-hierarchy, the fading of that astonishing vision in the generations that followed Paul. Later generations continued to produce letters in the name of Paul, but they progressively lost the original radical vision. They lost the vision. Here's a question we might keep in mind in this session and in all the following sessions. How have we done over the past 2,000 years since Paul's day in reclaiming and realizing Paul's original vision? Don't we still have a long way to go? And I have a very strong suspicion there are polarities, dichotomies, divisiveness that we have yet to recognize and grapple with. We haven't overcome the old dichotomies, the old divisions, but we probably have more that we ought to be considering. This is a vision that should drive us for the rest of human history, I dare say. So that's the gist of this course. Galatians 3, 27, 28, and how the early church dropped the ball, lost the vision, did not pursue the dream, and we're still trying to recover that vision, still trying to fulfill the dream. Here's what I have in mind for sessions 2 and 2, 3, 4, and 5. There are actually multiple versions of Paul in the New Testament. And that's why the contradictions are there. There are 13 books altogether attributed to the Apostle Paul in the New Testament, and scholars are confident that he wrote 7. So he did write a little more than half of the letters attributed to him, but the others, most scholars believe he did not write. They were written in his name by later generations. And sadly, it's in those later generations where the nerve failed, the vision was lost, the dream was given up. So people still revered Paul, they still loved him, and they wrote letters in his name for many years, trying to keep his name alive, his authority alive. But in fact, they were departing from his vision, departing from his dream. So we need to talk about the phenomenon of pseudonymity, that is, writing under a false name, because that's what's going on here. And this is a very, very common phenomenon in the ancient world. Biblical scholars are well aware of this. Students of the classics, Greek and Latin, are well aware of this practice. It was commonly done. And more than that, more than pseudonymity, writing in a false name, anonymity. People just didn't claim authorship the way we do now. The Gospels, I will share with you. I'll stir things up in over in that section of the New Testament. The Gospels, I would argue to you, are anonymous. We really don't know who wrote them. We really don't. There's no clear evidence whatsoever within any of the 4 canonical Gospels that would indicate the authors, indicate the names of the authors. Yes, names came to be attached to them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but those are late guesses. And I think that's really probably all they are. Sad to say. It would be wonderful to know who wrote those. But if those books were written by people who were content to remain anonymous, I think that needs to be recognized and embraced. They weren't claiming glory for themselves. They were claiming attention for a certain guy named Jesus of Nazareth. So anonymity, pseudonymity, we need to talk a bit about that. And we'll get into that for sure. Session 2 next week, next time we meet. Okay, so anonymity and pseudonymity. For the purposes of this class, the major innovation introduced by the authors of the pseudonymous letters of Paul, the 6 letters attributed to Paul, but probably not written by him. The major innovation introduced by them, actually there are a lot of innovations, but the major one we're going to be looking at is that they came up with this idea that Christians should live by household codes that describe the proper attitude and behavior of husband and wife, father and child, master and slave. So those are the 3 pairings that occur again and again and again in household codes. Household codes written by Christians and household codes written by other people who are not Christians. These household codes were common in the ancient world, very, very, very common. And by early Christians picking up the household codes and attributing them to beloved, dearly departed Apostle Paul, that shows Christians caving into the pressure of business as usual in the Mediterranean world. Traditional, classic Mediterranean patriarchy, hierarchy. This person set over against that person, and one person above the other person. So this is fascinating stuff to me because there are polarities here, and always and forever, one of the 2 assumes dominance over the other. Husband over wife, father over child, master over slave. Slavery is really at the core of this. It's the most obvious naked form of this dichotomy and the dominance of one person over another. So the Christians writing in the name of Paul, late first century, early second century, years and years and years after Paul had been martyred, they are giving up, they are losing the vision, they are denying the dream, ceasing to pursue the dream of Paul's radical, egalitarian, anti-patriarchal, anti-hierarchical way of life. In the 7 indisputable letters, the letters that everyone, all scholars can agree that he wrote, there's not a whisper, not a whiff, not a touch of those household codes. They come in the literature that's later, after Paul is gone, and it comes from the time when the early church, sad to say, is losing its nerve. So that's what we're going to be talking a lot about in this. And there are 3 topics I'd like to pursue. One is gender roles. That's going back up here. I didn't know, it was a tough decision to come to try to figure out which of the 3 to deal with first, but I decided to go with the gender roles first. So gender roles first, and you won't, well, maybe you will believe. If you've read your New Testament, you'll know the kind of stuff that I want to zero in on, where Paul, so-called, pseudonymous Paul, false Paul, fake Paul, where that's the Paul who says that women should shut up and have no role to play in leadership in the church. And he says more, and it's just as bad. So roles for men and women in the church. And then I'd like to look next at slavery. The false Paul, the Paul of the letters that were written in his name by a later generation, the false Paul, the pseudonymous Paul, says that slaves should obey their masters. He doesn't offer a critique of slavery whatsoever, but that's not Paul. That's the later Paul, the wannabe Paul. So slavery, we'll deal with that. And then the fate of Israel. The fate of Israel. I want to end with that because that's haunting. Let me throw in the note that what did Paul devote his life to the most? The one piece of the vision that he lived and probably died for was there is no longer Jew or Greek. That's what he devoted himself to completely. That was what his career, his ministry as an apostle was all about. He cared about the slave issue, and we'll talk about that. And he cared deeply about the male-female issue. And I have some astonishing passages from the real Paul, the legitimate Paul, the authentic Paul, to share with you on that. But what did he live and die for? Jew and Greek. There is no longer Jew or Greek for Paul. There cannot be, there should not be, there must not be a division between Jew and what does Greek mean? It really means non-Jew. So this is a way of dividing the world, dividing cultures, dividing ethnic groups into Jew and everyone else. It's the us, them thing. That's what all of these are about. Us, them, but particularly the ethnic, cultural, religious division between Jew and non-Jew. Paul gave everything he had to try to overcome that, and he would be sad to learn if he were to get in the time machine and come back to us today, he'd be sad to learn that we have not achieved that vision and have not done all that well with the other parts of the vision as well. So I think I might be able to sneak in a little tiny taste of session number 2, but let me just point out the rest of this handout here. I have several books here. Steve Patterson's book, which I think is wonderful. And then there are a couple of books here that I've either read for the first time. Brandon Scott is a friend and colleague, and I just read this book for the first time, and it's quite good. And Borg and Crossan are two of my favorite all-time New Testament scholars. So that's great stuff. I thought there might be some eager Bible students in this class who might want to do some other reading as well. Here are some wonderful websites that would be at your fingertips. I'm delighted to share these. They're all solid, reliable, strongly academic. The one that's the most popularly written is by the Biblical Archaeological Society. They produce a magazine. They produce a magazine for decades, but under that title. So this is popularly written, but it's written by scholars in a accessible, understandable, popular style. About all of these are really written in an accessible style, but these two particularly are nicely done by scholars, trying very hard to be accessible and understandable, engaging. And the Bible Gateway is a fantastic resource to find just about every Bible translation under the sun, at least in our time. So these are all wonderful resources that I would recommend very highly. Why don't I sneak on ahead and get a few things on the table here from next suppose for next time. Okay, let me see how much I can bite off here. So this is a sneak peek, a few minutes stepping into what we really ought to be doing for next week. But you'll see that I've got lots and lots of stuff in mind for next week. So it's a good idea to get a head start on it. So why don't we go ahead and at least I can pull up these documents and show them to you. We will not deal with them in any detail. And in fact, that's not what I want. There we go. That's what I want. In fact, we're not going to deal with them in much detail next week, but you'll have to forgive a retired professor. He has a tendency to go overboard. The joke is, of course, that professors can't talk for any length of time unless they have 50 minutes, a 50-minute class session to deal with. And a lot of my class sessions were an hour and 20 minutes. So I will not dump on you like that. But here's something we'll talk about more next week. Here's the breakdown between the real Paul, the indisputable Paul, the Paul that everyone agrees is really Paul. 7 letters: Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, Philemon. Everyone knows that Paul wrote those. There's no argument among scholars about that. And then there's the book of Acts, which is not by Paul, not attributed to Paul, but it's a lot about Paul. He ends up being the major character in the second half of the book of Acts, at least. Here's the wannabe Paul, the later versions of Paul. Ephesians, Colossians, 2nd Thessalonians. I'm suggesting those are probably written, let's say in the generation after Paul. Let me back up. When did Paul himself write? Paul probably became a Jesus person in the 30s. Jesus was probably executed around the year 30. And within a year or 2 or 3, Paul was on the bandwagon. He had been He had seen the light, so to speak. The traditional story is Road to Damascus, which the book of Acts tells the story 3 times. Paul never tells the story himself. So that's one of many differences between the real Paul and the wannabe Pauls of the book of Acts, the Deuteropaulines, which just means second team, second tier Pauline, and then the pastoral letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. They're called pastoral letters because the version of Paul there is like a senior pastor writing to junior pastors, Timothy and Titus. So an elder leader in the church writing to a younger leader in the church. And that style, that approach is radically different from what Paul is doing in his authentic letters. Paul is probably doing most of his letter writing in the 50s. Now, a number of years after he'd begun his apostolic outreach to the Gentile nations, as he says, is his calling. These 3 letters, Ephesians, Colossians, 2nd Thessalonians, were probably written in, say, the 70s or 80s, a generation after Paul. Paul, we think, was martyred by the Emperor Nero or his those under his command in the 60s. 64 is often a guess as to when the martyrdom of Peter and Paul might have taken place. So 70s or 80s, those letters might have been written then, and then another generation beyond that. So late 1st century or early 2nd century is probably when these letters are written, because there are all kinds of differences, all kinds of discrepancies, contradictions between these letters. It's in these letters, the Deuteropaulines and the pastorals, that the household codes begin to come into play, and women are put in their place. Slaves are told sternly to obey their masters, and so on. So it's in that location that stuff happens. If you don't like Paul, if you think you don't like Paul, it's probably because you read the Paul of these letters. That's usually the situation. A lot of people despise Paul. They find Paul appalling. John Dominic Crossan and Marcus Borg say. But usually it's not the real Paul, it's the wannabe Paul, the later Paul, the ersatz Paul that upsets people. So this Paul here is radically egalitarian, radically anti-hierarchical. Remember, that's the Paul who says there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male and female. That's Paul. Egalitarian, anti-hierarchical. The Paul at the other end of the spectrum is totally androcentric, patriarchal, hierarchical, traditionalist. So we've gone from radical egalitarianism to what Borg and Crossan called the reactionary Paul, the anti-Paul, the Paul who throws out the window all the radical, beautiful vision of egalitarianism and anti-hierarchy and anti-patriarchy. Paul is routinely despised by many as a misogynist who puts women down. That's not Paul. That's the fake Paul, the wannabe Paul, the ersatz Paul. So, okay. So that's that. We can look at that more next week. And forgive me. We'll share this handout with you. I hope you can read it, or probably you're better off to look at it in your hot fingers. because this takes up an entire 8.5 by 11 sheet, and it's 4 columns. This is a landscape document, and we cannot not go through this in painful detail. But this is the household code in operation here. It's wives, husbands, children, fathers, slaves, masters. These 3 pairings of first century Mediterranean culture generally. There ain't nothing here particularly Christian. What we got here is classic, traditional Mediterranean patriarchy, hierarchy. And this is what the early church reverted to, went back to after losing their nerve, after fumbling the ball, after losing the vision that not only Paul, but I would say this really goes back to Jesus probably, although we don't have a lot of quotations from Jesus about wives, husbands, children, fathers, slaves, masters. It's really in the 13 letters attributed to Paul that we begin to get those topics, those relationships explored. So this is a gigantic handout, and I apologize for the immensity of it, but you can look at it on your own and study it to your heart's content. So, and slaves. This is the pro-slavery Paul, and these are the passages that slave owners in the American South could quote endlessly, and they could say the Bible says that slaves are to obey their masters. Maybe the worst, the most offensive of such passages is here in Titus, which is supposed to be a letter of Paul. Tell slaves to be submissive to their masters and to give satisfaction in every respect. They are not to talk back, not to pilfer, because we all know slaves like to steal from their masters. That's the stereotype going back thousands of years. Rather, slaves are to show complete and perfect fidelity so that in everything they may be an ornament to the doctrine of God our Savior. So it's your religious duty, your Christian duty, you slaves, to obey your masters. So that's the kind of passage that makes the hair on the back of my neck curl, and similarly about husbands and wives and so on. It's interesting that throughout these different versions of the same household code, it always starts out with the subservient member of the relationship. It always starts out with the inferior one. Wives, obey your husbands. Children, obey your parents, your fathers, really. Slaves, obey your masters. So it always starts out with the subservient one, the inferior one, which is to obey the superior one. And who's the superior one? The man. The man rules the woman. That's what patriarchy means, rule of the father. The man rules the woman. The man rules the children. The man rules the slaves. So that's the common denominator in all this. And that's not Paul. That's not Paul. Okay, and then, so in our fifth and final session, we're going to deal with Israel. We're going to deal with Israel. In several of these sessions and several of these handouts, I have parallel columns here, and I put the fake Paul on the left and the real Paul on the right. And with Israel, I think I would simply go back up to here. It's sad that the author of the book of Acts, which is thought to be Luke, whoever wrote the Gospel of Luke, and we really don't know the name for sure, but whoever wrote the Gospel of Luke apparently wrote the Acts of the Apostles. And several times in the book of Acts, the charge is leveled against Jews that they killed Jesus, that Jews are responsible for the death of Jesus. That's horrible. That's absolutely horrible. It happens to be historically false. Rome killed Jesus. Crucifixion is a Roman punishment. The Jews were not allowed to use it. The Jews were not allowed to exercise capital punishment all on their own. Capital punishment was a Roman prerogative, and crucifixion was a Roman practice. And then there is the further sad result of the book of Acts, and that is that by the end of the book of Acts, Paul, that version of Paul, not the real Paul, but the Acts version of Paul, in the end, he has given up on Israel. Israel is hopeless. Israel has not accepted the gospel of Jesus. And Paul, at the end of Acts, says, this movement, this reality of which we are part, is now for the Gentiles. The Gentiles are our future. And that would have broken the heart of the real Paul, of the radical Paul, the authentic Paul. God bless you all. Let's have some interesting conversation. Take care.